For those of you, can I get a quick show of hands in the audience? How many of you are developers? Hopefully, yeah, that'll make life much easier. All right. I am, for those of you who have not encountered us before, I am Stephen O'Grady. I'm the co-founder of RedMonk. RedMonk is a developer-focused, developer-centric industry analyst firm. Quick show of hands, how many of you know what an analyst firm is, what we do? I got one back. Yeah, okay, pat at the back. So very quickly, an analyst firm is somebody who basically looks at what all of you developers do individually. Each of you is making choices every day, right? You're making choices about databases, you're making choices about services, you're making choices about operating systems, tools, etc. So our job is to look at what you are all doing individually and to try to roll that up and present big picture, right? To try to look at, in the grand scheme of things, what's going on? You know, what tools are being used? Why are they being used? You know, what is the sort of bigger picture trend so that as developers, you can sort of get on with your lives, you know, using the tools that you want to use, but sort of, you know, looking up every so often to see, hey, what else is going on? Are there things that I should be aware of? So, you know, really when we look at the world, the bigger picture for us is that things are changing. And things are changing quite profoundly. This is obviously a quote from somebody that I'm quite sure many, if not most of you, who have read before. But this really describes the world that we see. The world that we see is all about change. And, you know, yes, to some degree that's axiomatic. The tech industry is changing all the time. So that's an abstract term. What does that mean? Well, it means that the dynamics of adoption, the dynamics of building applications have fundamentally shifted and shifted permanently in a relatively short span of time. And they shifted according to a couple of dynamics, which we don't have time to go through all of them today. I only have a half hour. But I think it's important for all of you to understand because there is this change, right? In other words, the title of this talk, which is Services in the Cambrian Explosion of Technology, is going to affect the lives of each and every one of you as you go out and build and develop new applications. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's easy for us to sort of forget this now. Does anybody know the Share group? Has anybody heard this before? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. All right. So Share was a sort of a proto-user group, right? Founded in the 50s and 60s by users of IBM hardware. And as a proto-user group, they did a lot of what user groups do today, right? They got together, they got to sort of chance to exchange notes and things that worked, things that didn't, bug fixes, workarounds, and very importantly, source code. Which begs the question, how are user groups exchanging customized source code for IBM hardware? How did that work? Well, it turns out that in the 50s and 60s, software was really just a means, right? Yes, there was a commercial software industry and people were trying to sell software assets, but by and large, most businesses were founded along something else. And in IBM's case, that was basically selling hardware. So by that measure, anything that makes it easier for them to sell hardware, i.e., hey, here's the source code, makes their life easier, and it's just a simple business decision. So you have this Share user group running around exchanging customized versions of the operating system, and this is the way that things were for an extended period of time. And it really wasn't until the Department of Justice stepped in at one point and said, hey, IBM, this is probably not super fair to competitors of yours. You know, hey, you need to start charging for this, that things changed for IBM. For the market, things changed a little bit differently. So this is a very, very simple plot. Many of you have probably seen things like it in articles about Microsoft. But really, you know, this describes in many respects, this is a trajectory that essentially transcends the arc of software and the history of software over this time period. So most of you probably know the history. In 1980, 80, 81, IBM approached Microsoft and said, hey, look, you know, we have this personal computer that we want to sell, but, you know, hey, we need an operating system for it. We're obviously not going to use our sort of mainframe operating system to do that. So, hey, can you do something about this? So they put together what ultimately became PC-DOS, and they looked at it very differently. Instead of looking at it and saying, hey, this software only exists to sell this piece of hardware, Microsoft looked at it and said, hey, this software is valuable. I think we can sell this. I think we want to sell this. And, you know, as you can see, they were certainly rewarded by the market for doing so, and over time became, you know, one of the biggest companies in the world, primarily on the backs of selling software. So software, which, as we just discussed, had been just a means to sell a piece of hardware or something else, all of a sudden was something materially different. It was something that you bought and sold as a product. And the bought and sold piece is important, because ultimately, if you're designing a product to be used by developers, that's one thing. If you're designing a product that's only purpose is to be bought, then this happens. So these are the people who controlled software development for an extended period of time. Now, who are these people is a logical question. The answer is that they're just a random bunch of CIOs that I found on Google. But ultimately, this is what sort of characterized software development for many years, right? Which was the fact that, hey, look, if software is an end and I'm building it to sell it, it's much easier for me to sell it to one person at an organization than it is to sell to the entire developer population. So, things like manageability, security, all these kinds of things become front and center. Because why? Because that's what people like this care about. And that's the question we get all the time. Why did enterprise applications for so many years just look terrible? And why were they so hard to use? Well, the answer is that wasn't the priority for these guys. Right? These guys, were far more interested in, can I manage it? Can I secure it? How much does it cost? What are the licensing agreements? Right? So we begin to see how the sort of way that software is developed, and more importantly, why it is developed and how it is developed, really has an impact in terms of what actually gets produced. Right? So this was the sort of status quo for an extended period of time, and for really decades. This was sort of how things worked. We had a market, the market had a couple different entrants, and so on. But the interesting thing is that the game was already changing. And not to sort of do a commercial pitch here, but we wrote a book on this. The book is on Amazon. It's called The New Kingmakers. That has all sorts of information about this if you're interested. As I said, I don't have time to go into all the reasons, but we're going to talk about two here today. Two that are very, very important and fundamentally transform the life of everybody in this room, developer or no. So the first is quite obviously open source. And I'm quite sure that I don't need to educate any of you on what open source is, how it came about, and so on. I'm sure many of you know the history as well as, if not better, than I do. Many of you have probably sort of built some of the core projects, right, that have come to define the success of open source in the marketplace. But from our perspective, as analysts, open source really began to shift fundamentally the empowerment and the ability of developers to function within an organization. Now, how does it do that? Well, if you think about it, 10 years ago, certainly 15 years ago, if I wanted to do anything, if I wanted to build an application, if I wanted to build a service, build a product, I needed software to do that, right? I needed an operating system, probably needed a database, needed some sort of runtime, whether it has to be, whether that's a sort of local runtime or some sort of, web application server, probably need that. We need all sorts of different pieces, right? By and large, these are things that I had to pay for. It's baffling when I talk to, just dating myself, it's funny, when I talk to developers today, the sort of idea of paying for tooling, I mean, it's just absolutely baffling beyond, hey, I paid X for a license of Sublime. They just can't understand. I don't understand. I have to pay for tools. What? Like, how does that work? This was the reality. This was reality for so many years. Open source comes along, and all of a sudden developers, hey, if you want to build something, great. Operating system, fine. There are free options. You want a database? Great. We have those too. Application servers? Great. Web servers? Great. Caching layers? Great. Tools? Great. Runtime? Etc. All of a sudden you have all this software available for free. All this software that lets you go out and be creative and do these wonderful things. Okay, that's great, but I kind of need some place to run this stuff, right? I kind of need some place to put it. At the end of the day, I still need some hardware. So, fantastic. Enter cloud. So all of a sudden, there's a gentleman by the name of Flip Cromer. Some of you may know him. He was the CTO of a data startup called InfoChimps that got bought by CSC. Flip has a quote that's actually directly included in the documentation for a tool called Wukong, which is a big data tool that he wrote. And the quote, I think, is a great one, because it says that EC2 means that anybody with a $10 bill can rent a 10-node distributed cluster backed by a terabyte of storage for 8 hours, right? And that was written, I have to go back and look, probably 08, 09. So think about how that pricing has come down even since then, And more importantly, think about sort of as developers, right? How transformative is that? Prior to cloud, first of all, there's no renting for 8 hours, right? That concept, outside of time sharing, if we go way back, just doesn't exist. You can't do that. So if you want hardware, you have to go out and buy your 10 nodes. You have to go out and buy storage. And guess what? Now you own that, have to run it, manage it, and so on. So when you start putting some of these pieces together, developers have access to free or low-cost software. They have access to, for the first time, hardware that they can afford. Things begin to change. So for the first time, developers don't need to act for permission. If they want to build something, they just go off and build it. I actually talked to an executive at a company who actually manufactures hardware. He had one of his people come to him and say, hey, I've been working on this project that you gave me, and sorry, here's a $42,000 bill on my expense report for cloud services, and the executive was fine with it because he knew it would be faster. That's how transformative these things collectively have been. And again, we don't need to belabor that because I'm sure you're using them all the time. The net is that from our perspective, some of you may have seen this slide before, this describes the world that we live in. And this is a world that is more true by the day. So for those of you who are not familiar with Venn diagrams, they work pretty simply. You're looking for the overlap, right? So we talk to IT, quote-unquote, IT decision makers every day. And they'll tell us things like, yeah, we don't use cloud, we don't use software as a service. And then you go out and actually talk to developers and they say, yeah, I don't know what that guy's talking about. We use all that stuff all the time. And that's the world today. The world today is that CIOs really don't necessarily always know what's going on because the developers are off making choices. And that ultimately is a huge part of the point of this talk today. A huge part of the concern is that we now have more developers making more choices. So if we go back to the slide I showed you earlier with the heads, the CIOs, right? If we go back to that slide, and if we think about that, that's one person making a decision within an organization. Now think about sort of the mechanics of, okay, it's no longer one person. It might be 2 developers. It might be 20 developers. It might be 200, 2,000, 20,000, 200,000. If you have more people making more choices, you inevitably have more choices and a greater diversity of choices. So that brings us to part of the title, which is the Cambrian explosion. Have any of you seen this analogy before? The Cambrian explosion in technology? Okay. James has, yeah, of course. Anyhow, the idea is very simple. I'm not going to go into the evolutionary biology because I'm not an evolutionary biologist, and somebody undoubtedly in the room knows more about it than I do. But essentially, the simple version is this. The evolution of species was very simple and very linear up to a certain point. And then for reasons that some are understood, some of the mechanics are fairly well locked, some of them are still sort of a mystery, all of a sudden we come to the Cambrian era and there's this huge explosion. So we go from very, very simple and a very small number of organisms to incredibly complex organisms across a huge array of species. And it happens, geologically speaking, of course, in a very, very short span of time. And that ultimately is what we're seeing in technology. And this comparison was first made by a guy by the name of Brian Aker. Brian, some of you may know Brian. He's one of the core committers to was one of the core committers to the MySQL project. Now spends a lot of time on OpenStack. And he made this sort of comparison a while ago, and we thought, actually that's exactly what we're seeing. Because if you think about it, each of you, I'm sure, encounters this every day. Think about the diversity of choices you have in any category that you want, whether we're talking about services, software, hardware, whatever. It used to be if I want a database, I have 3 choices because, hey, everything's relational. Now, you probably have half a dozen relational choices that are defensible, to a CIO. But by the way, you also have a number of choices in a document database, a number of choices in a key value database, a number of choices from a MapReduce engine, a number of choices from a graph database, and so on. We're seeing this incredible explosion of alternative options, alternative projects, and so on. And it's driven why? Where is this coming from? It's coming from developer empowerment. As more of you are empowered, as more of you have the opportunity to make decisions, guess what? You're making a lot more different decisions. And this is probably nowhere more obvious than here. You don't need to read this. It's an eye chart. This is part of an analysis that we do basically twice a year. And this is our programming language rankings. What we end up doing is comparing the ranking and the popularity of programming language rankings on GitHub and on Stack Overflow. Now, we don't make any sort of representation that this is statistically representative of the industry as a whole. We just think it's a very interesting sample of very interesting populations, and the correlation's actually been very interesting. But the point for us today, the most important takeaway, is that the first time that we saw this, it was done by two gentlemen, Drew Conway, who now works at an analytics startup, John Miles White, now works down the road at Facebook. They put this together, and we said, that's actually, we want to look at what that looks like over time. We've been doing it ever since, and that's, I don't know, 09, 2010, we've been doing this. And the interesting thing is that in all the years we've been doing this, you see clumps, right? You can kind of perceive them here. You have one clump at the top right, a clump that's sort of below that. So, yes, you see popular languages, things like Java, JavaScript, Python, Ruby, etc. C, C++, they're sort of in that sort of top clump, right? No surprise there. Tremendously popular languages, everybody knows that. In the second clump, we're seeing other still popular languages, things like Clojure, Groovy, Go, R. And the point here is that we're beginning to see incredible diversity within enterprises in terms of the languages that they use, right? So it was never true, even 10 or 15 years ago, as much as the press would have you believe, that if every enterprise application was written in either Java.net, right? People would say that, never true. Tons of Perl, lots of other things running around. But the fact is today, when we walk out and talk to businesses, they may be using any one of half a dozen or a dozen languages. Why? Because developers are making these choices. They're saying, you know what, Java's fine for this, but I want to use JavaScript here and Python over here, and this really needs to be fast, so I'm going to write it in C. And you see this tremendous diversity. So this is great, right? Hey, developers are empowered, and we have all this choice, and we get to use what we want. There's a catch. The catch is that choice is not free. Now, we sort of intrinsically think as choice is intrinsic good, right? Because, not to pick on an operating system vendor, but people typically want more than one choice. You don't want to have to buy an operating system, or anything else for that matter, from one person all the time forever. And it's not really good for the vendor long term anyway, but we won't go into that. The point here is that we want some choice. We want to be able to say, yeah, you know what, if I don't like what you're doing to me, I can go over to this guy, or this person, or whatever. The problem, however, is that as you move forward, there is an overhead. Has anybody read this book, The Paradox of Choice, Barry Schwartz? I highly recommend it. We have a guy here. Highly recommend it. If you haven't, check it out. Because the basic idea is that choice at some point becomes a burden. Choice at some point becomes a problem. If I have to choose between 2 or 3 things, not a big deal. If I have to choose between 6 or 7, okay, probably still manageable. If I have to choose between 10, 15, 20, I'm not really that fired up about that anymore. And this is the thing. We were always curious, and curious not necessarily in a good way, about this developer empowerment, this explosion, this Cambrian explosion of diversity. What do we have, right? What are our opportunities in terms of trying to make these decisions, and how efficiently can we make them, and more importantly, is it sustainable? Because the concern ultimately was that, choice at some point may become a problem for developers. So we were wondering if or when we would begin to see this. And we have. So this is a quote from Tim Bray, a very recent quote. Some of you may know Tim. Tim's a very, very well-known technologist. He's one of the co-inventors of XML. Spent a long time at Google, a long time at Sun, well-known for many other things in his career. But this quote I thought was very interesting. There is a real cost to continuous widening the base of knowledge a developer has to remain relevant. So this is one of the first signs that you begin to see that, well, wait, I like the choice, I like the diversity, I like that I have lots of options, but wait, I have to keep up on all of these now? And he talks, and we'll come back to this, he talks about the concept of a full stack developer, right? So basically, say from the metal up, all the way to the front end. Think about all of the choices that go into that. Think about all of the opportunities there are to make mistakes, or to get burdened to say, I don't want to pick between these, I just want to build something. So Tim linked to a piece by a guy by the name of Ed Finkler. Similar concerns. My tolerance for learning curves grows smaller every day. New technologies, once exciting for the sake of newness, now seem like hassles. And I don't know if any of you in the room have experienced this, are experiencing this, might experience this in future, but I'd bet on the latter at some point. Because anybody in the room know Marco Arment? All right, Marco is pretty well known again. He is the founder of Instapaper, one of the first developers at Tumblr, and he said this in response to what Ed Finkler said: I feel the same way. It's one of the reasons I've lost almost all interest in being a web developer. Now think about that. This is one of the first guys at Tumblr, has built businesses on his own, sold them, done very well for himself, and he's lost almost all interest in his craft. Why? Because there's too much. There's too much choice. There are too many options. The burden here is enormous. The burden here is a serious problem over time, and it's only getting worse as each category fragments. If we think about, for example, the web space, right? In the web space, it used to be that you had these huge monolithic frameworks, the Django's, the Rails, and so on, which, hey, solve all your problems if you want to build a website. What have we seen since? What is popular since? The rise of micro frameworks. And again, that sounds like a good idea. Rather than have this one thing that, in the case of Rails, sort of defines opinionated software, I want something I have a little bit more flexibility. So I'm going to carve this up, pick individual micro frameworks, and work off of that. I solve an individual problem, and I can pick these. Problem is, that doesn't scale all that well, ultimately, right? Because we have all these micro frameworks, then within the micro framework category, you have multiple options, and all of a sudden, where you're making one decision before, now you're making 3 or 4, and each of those 3 or 4 decisions involves multiple decisions in there. So you can see how things snowball, and you can see, how somebody like Marco comes to this conclusion, which is, I've lost almost all interest in doing this, which to me is a very sad thing. So, all right, you probably think, fine, maybe I buy this, maybe I don't. Choice is a mixed bag. Question is, what do I do? And this is the most important part of the presentation. These are the things that I think, hope, you'll leave here with. So the first is you need to focus. You need to think about what you're doing, and more importantly, what you like. So focus, obviously, is an abstraction, not terribly useful in and of itself. This can apply to virtually anything. So what do I mean? What does focus mean? It means that, let's go back to that concept that Tim Bray was talking about, the full, quote-unquote, full-stack developer. Do you, any of you, building an application, building a service, building a product, just building a toy that you want to use in your spare time, do you want to have to make every decision from the stack all the way presented to the user? I mean, literally. Do you want to make operating system decisions, database decisions, caching decisions, framework decisions, runtime decisions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And more importantly, even if you want to, are you capable? Do you have the time to go through all of these and to vet them appropriately and to determine this will or won't work? Hey, this is the best framework. And the difficulty, we had a great presentation at a conference that we run back in my hometown of Portland, Maine, and Cliff Moon is a developer at Boundary. And he talked about some of the problems that Boundary had. Because Boundary would look at this and say, hey, you know what, there's a couple different key value options. They're pretty good, but we think we can do better, and we want this other feature, right? And it's not technically not invented here. That's not really the point, although it looks a lot like that. So what ends up happening? It ends up that, not surprisingly, if you're trying to not only make these decisions but solve all these problems yourself, you quickly get bogged down. There's an enormous overhead attached to that, which won't surprise virtually anybody. So great, you need to focus. You need to determine, if you're building something, what is important to you? What do you like building? So let's say, for the sake of argument, that building an application, building a service looks like this, right? You have a lot of different moving pieces. And let's say that you've followed through from the example that we just talked about in terms of focus. And let's say that you've done a great job and you say, you know what, out of all these different things, the only thing I really care about here is the hamster wheel. That's it. Everything else, don't really care. So you have a couple different choices, right? You can look at this and say, all right, fantastic, I know what I want to do. I'm just going to focus on that. I'm going to try to outsource as many of these decisions as I can. So you can have other people obviously build things, for you. You can buy things. This is, frankly, what a lot of people end up doing. They buy package solutions, where vendors are being paid essentially to make decisions on their behalf and then support them. Or you can leverage services. And nowhere, frankly, is this more obvious and more sort of apparent than we see in the mobile world today. What is a mobile application? Typically, it's just a wrapper around a bunch of services. Right? You think about things that go into a mobile application, probably geo, location. Is anybody really building that? Or are you more likely to leverage that as a service? Probably a service. Think about authentication, authorization, identity. If you're starting a new application, are you going to build that yourself? Is that going to be profitable, useful use of your time? Probably not. So the point here is that, yes, in mobile, but in other areas as well, you need to look at what you're doing, you need to look at what you're building and determine, is this something I really need to build? And do I need to, sort of by extension, assume all of the choices that come along with that? Or, hey, can I say, you know what, I want to focus on the hamster wheel, and I'm going to get these other pieces of services and combine them. That seems to be an approach that a lot of people are taking, and more importantly, it seems to be an approach that's working. And this is the last chart that I will leave you with. You can't really make this out, I'm sure. It's kind of small. What this is a chart of PP&E, which is plants, property, and equipment. So basically, how much are companies spending on infrastructure? This is from 2000 through 2014, I think. And the point here is that you have a whole bunch of companies, Apple, Facebook, Google, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're spending tons and tons of money in terms of building out infrastructure. What I don't know if you can see here, I don't know if it comes out, there's a yellow line here. That yellow line is Netflix. Netflix has looked at the idea and the sort of business opportunity, obviously, of building out movies and TV and everything else that they stream. And they have looked at this and come to a relatively unique conclusion today, and one that I would bet is not going to be so unique down the line. They look at this and say, all right, I could, as Netflix, I could invest in building all my data centers. So now I got a bunch of choices to make. I got to decide where to situate the data center. I got to decide where to get my power. I got to decide what to do with my physical machines. I have to decide, what networking equipment, how to assemble this all together. I have to find the people and so on. Or you know what? I have a different idea. I can just consume this as a service and make my life easier. And here's the thing, is that if you get locked into one supplier, okay, maybe that's not such a great idea. It's not to say that services don't come with their own questions attached, but at the end of the day, Netflix gets to focus on what Netflix wants to focus on, which is delivering movies and TV. There's a great story years ago in terms of the streaming business and the Netflix by mail, and they said, look, when we founded the service, we called it Netflix for a reason. We didn't call it DVDs by mail. This was always their vision. This is always their intent, was to build this kind of service. And if you've ever had the opportunity to hear Adrian Cockcroft talk, Adrian's very, very good. He's from Netflix. He's one of the original architects of this plan. He speaks about it often. The idea here is that if you're Netflix, if you're any of the developers here today in the audience, you can look at this and say, look, there's this huge explosion of different options. I have all these different choices to make. What choices do I want to make? What choices do I need to make? And is there a way to leverage services from wherever to make my life simpler and to reduce the need and the volume of choices I have to make, so I get to make the ones that I want to make and that are important to me instead of every choice along the way. And with that, I am done. I don't know if we have time for questions. Not getting any cues. Are there any questions? Right here? I think we got a mic up here.
I read recently that several people were switching back to bare metal servers, and they were claiming that there was a 3x cost difference between going bare metal versus, say, Amazon Web Services. Your slide looks different than that. Can you comment on that?
Well, this slide, to be clear, is basically the amount that companies have invested in their plants, property, and equipment, as opposed to here are the costs attached. But the interesting thing sort of about Netflix, right? So one of the things that Netflix found out, and Adrian, I think, has talked about this, I've heard a number of other people discuss it, is that, not surprisingly for a service, they'll spin up 10,000 images and some of them are faster than others, right? So then the question became, all right, well, how do I, how do I determine this? Do I need to have a service and so on? So what Netflix does is basically they say, all right, if I need, say, 5,000 servers or instances, I'll spin up 15,000. I'll monitor them. I'll keep the fastest 5,000, and I'll kill the rest. Because you have a high degree of diversity. Now, there may be some instances where, for various reasons, you actually do need metal. And those are things that you may want to focus on. Those are opportunities, frankly, where hey, you may need to build it yourself. But the key, like I said, if you go back to focus, you need to determine up front, ahead of time, is that something that actually matters to me or not? Because in the vast majority of cases, the performance you get, particularly if you're going to optimize for the faster instances, will be just fine. But you may come to a different conclusion, which is, look, speed is everything for me. I absolutely need the fastest performance, in which case, you're going to make a different decision. Right here.
You had mentioned the explosion of developer choices and the pain of becoming a full stack developer based on that. Can you expand on that some?
Yeah. So in other words, the basic idea is that if we think full stack developer, right? Let's make it easy. Let's say that you're not even going to get into the metal, right? You're not going to get into choosing hardware and everything else. You're just going to start with Amazon or Force.com or anything else, any other sort of platform, and build up from there. Think about all the different choices you need to make in terms of being a developer, right? So a lot of times we have front-end developers, we have database administrators, we have sysadmins. The idea behind a full-stack developer is that you have to take all of those different roles and cram them into one person, right? So you have to be equally able to make a decision between, this is the best, JavaScript micro framework for my front end, and by the way, this is going to be the lowest latency caching system for me, at scale of millions of servers. Frankly, it's not terribly realistic because, to do any one of those things takes a lot of time. To do all of those things involved in being a full-scale developer, from, here are the JavaScript, frameworks down to, caching, app server, database server, web server, virtualization, maybe platform or cloud infrastructure attached to that. To make all of those decisions and to make them well is really difficult. So what we see a lot of people doing is saying, full-scale stuff, not for me. You know what? I'll rely on this service, rely on that service. I'm going to combine that and package that with my secret sauce, and boom, now I have an application, I have a product, I have a service that I only had to make these, this amount of decisions for, versus every decision under the sun. Any other questions? All right, I think we're good. Thank you very much. Be around.